Before I pass on to our speaker, I would like to say a few words about Philip Stratton-Lake. So, Philip left school at 16. I was trying to make him a little bit nervous. I was on Philip's original appointment panel, so I might be able to make him nervous. Philip left school at 16 with no qualifications and started working for a local bus company, which actually is quite good training for a life in philosophy. It wasn't until he was 22 that he decided to get some qualifications, so he did a couple of A-levels at night school. He then decided to take the big plunge and go to university. He'd read some philosophy and he was interested, but he didn't think he understood enough of it to do a degree in philosophy. So he actually started out doing a degree in art history and took a module or an option in philosophy and was very quickly hooked and changed his degree to philosophy and graduated with a first-class degree. He embarked straight away on a PhD on Kant's notion of rationality. Nervous about being a late starter, he finished his PhD in record time. His first full-time lectureship was at Kiel University, and he was first rather anxious about his new colleagues, many of whom were ethical intuitionists, a position that he thought was dead and buried in the 1930s. Philip admits now that the truth of matter was that he knew almost nothing about it. So to help mix in with his new colleagues, he read the canonical intuitionist text by W.D. Ross, The Right and the Good. He was instantly converted to this view and wrote to his previous teachers saying how everything had now become clear now that he'd read Ross, and that he had rejected Kant's moral philosophy in favour of Ross's. They must have been absolutely delighted with that news. I can imagine. This experience shaped the rest of Philip's philosophical career. He's since done his best to contribute to the revival of ethical intuitionism and to defend and clarify Ross's views. In 1998, we were very fortunate when he came from Kiel to Reading and was made professor in 2005. He was head of department from 2005 to 2009 and head of school from 2011 until October this year, and is now on very well-deserved research leave, completing his long overdue book on Ross. So before I hand over to Philip, a couple of points. You may have noticed the camera and iPad in the theatre. This is because we are both filming and live streaming via Periscope tonight's lecture, and that will include the question and answer session. So please make yourselves known to us if you have any questions about that. If you're an avid Twitter user, and I know there is one here in the room, please join the debate tonight and use our hashtag #YouAreLectures. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight's lecture, Professor Philip Stratton-Lake. Thank you.
Thank you. Coming out on a rather miserable evening. Tempted by a title with some big concepts in it, Freedom and the Meaning of Life. I've got 45 minutes, so I don't really want to get your hopes up too much that you're going to have an answer to life, the universe and everything, but I'll see what I can do. Okay, so choosing the good life. A number of early 20th century philosophers, I've got two up there, Camus at the top and Jean-Paul Sartre at the bottom, thought that our freedom is such that a meaningful life is one lived in accordance with self-created values. We just literally choose what values by an act of freedom we have, and we're free insofar as we live in accordance with those self-created values. This was quite an exciting time in philosophy at the times. It seemed like a revolutionary break with the past. And this is the kind of growth, those of you know, would be existential philosophy, which is quite radical at the time. I mean, Sartre really thought we choose everything. We choose our sexuality, we choose when we're exhausted and fall down. But most of the time we're in denial and pretend we're just things pushed around by our essences and dominated by external values. But insofar as we're authentic and let our true freedom come through, then we're the source of everything that matters. That extreme view hasn't really lasted in philosophy, but a kind of diluted sense has got through into public kind of consciousness, I think. Unfortunately, I think it's all a great mistake on a number of levels. I'm going to try and persuade you all of that today. We can choose to live a life that has value. What we can't do is choose that it has value. If there are no objective values, we can't create them, but we don't need to. Living in accordance with objective values that don't stem from the will, which are independent of the will, is quite compatible with our own freedom. We don't have to, as Sartre thought, live in bad faith or an inauthentic existence or dominated by others when we live in accordance to such values. But to get clear on how we're going to work through the various issues here, I sound like a typical philosopher here, we've got to get clear about the question. I think there's three different questions we need to distinguish. A question about what makes us happy or what makes for a happy life, what makes for a good life, and what makes for a meaningful life. Actually, the origin of this lecture stems from a discussion from one of my colleagues, John Cottingham, who was writing a book on the meaning of life at the time. And I was trying to persuade him there's nothing yet. This stuff about meaningfulness, you don't need all that. All you've got is a good life. You can call it a meaningful life if you like. That just kind of makes it sound very sexy and mysterious. But just there's a good life, that's it. And there's nothing more to living a good life than living a meaningful life. But I didn't have a very worked out view, so I've taken this opportunity to try to give some substance and, to those initial thoughts. And as always happens, they turn out to be wrong. But not that wrong. So these are three questions I think we need to distinguish. Might be that some of them are the same. Right? At this stage, that's just an open question. So let's start with the question of what makes us happy. Now I understand happiness in purely, to use a term of hedonistic terms, that is to say, I don't think there's any more to you being happy than you being in a pleasant state or having pleasant experiences. By pleasure, I understand that in quite an extended sense to mean not just pleasurable sensations, but to include states such as satisfaction or gratification, or perhaps even pride. Perhaps that's a pleasant state. Right? So the idea is that to be happy is just to be in some pleasant state or state of satisfaction. But pleasure is not what makes us happy. Right? Pleasure is what it is to be happy. What makes us happy is whatever it is that gives us pleasure. And that's different in different people. Right? What makes me happy is not what makes probably you happy. One thing I'm pretty sure of, I like anchovies. My wife hates anchovies. So eating anchovies makes me happy, makes my wife sick. There's nothing to argue about here. It's not like I've done something wrong, she's done something wrong. Right, so happiness is really just a wholly subjective. In my view, it's just a completely subjective matter. What makes us happy depends on our tastes, preferences, likes, desires, and so on. And that's different in different people. Also, there's some things that shouldn't give you pleasure. You might take pleasure in other people's suffering, not suggesting you do, but you might do, and that's something you ought not to take pleasure in. But that doesn't make it introduce any element of objectivity into happiness. All it means is that that's a bad thing to get pleasure in, but it doesn't mean that pleasure doesn't make you happy. It still makes you happy. So that's all I'm going to say about happiness. Happiness is just having a bit of fun. What about the question of a good life? Is that the same as a happy life? I don't think it is. And one of the standard ways philosophers try to persuade our students that it's not is with our happiness machine. Okay, so the thought experiment is this. It's not an argument, it's just a thought experiment. Imagine there's a machine which if you plugged yourself into it, it will just feed you constant pleasant sensations. Okay? Different ways of running. On some versions, it's kind of like plugging yourself into the Matrix. There's a kind of very real dream sequence. I'm thinking of something much cruder than that, where you just have pleasant sensations. So like the sort of sensation you get if you're having a good massage. You think, oh, that feels nice. That. And then the idea is that you can plug yourself into this for your whole life, and you'll have nothing but pleasure and no pain. Now, if a happy life is a pleasant life, this is an ideal of happiness. Right? It's just constant pleasure, no pain. And if you think you might get tired of a certain level of pleasure, you can imagine the machine's got a little dial on it. So after a couple of years, you might get a bit indifferent. Just turn it up a bit. Oh, that's better. It comes back. And technology develops, we can imagine, such that there's no limit where you, in a lifetime, would reach. Now that sounds like an ideal of a happy life, filled with nothing but happiness. But is it an ideal of a good life? Is it a meaningful life at all? Well, I think the answer to that is no, on both counts. And for that reason, personally, I wouldn't plug myself in. If you agree with me, then you think that the question of a good life is not the same as the question of what makes of a happy life, and is different from the question of a meaningful life. Okay, these are just different questions. You might think this would be an ideal of happiness, but it's not an ideally good life, so these are different things. And it looks to me to be utterly meaningless life, even though it's really quite pleasant. It's where things get a bit complicated. Although a life plugged into the pleasure machine may not be our idea of an ideally an ideally good life, it does look as though it's got something to be said for it. So I do think pleasure is one of the things that contributes towards a good life. It's not the same as a good life, but pleasant experiences contribute, one of the things that make for a good life. But it's another way, all other things being equal, the more pleasant life is going to be a better one than the less pleasant life. I think what would make us hesitate, if, like me, you wouldn't plug yourself in, what would make you hesitate is not that there's nothing to be said for such a life. It's not like plugging yourself into a machine that's going to put you in a coma for the rest of your life. What would make us hesitate, I think, is that we'd have to give up many other things that we value, and that we value a lot more than pleasure. And that's why we think this is not such a good life for ourselves. So what are these other goods that would have to be sacrificed in the pleasure machine? Well, I agree with Tim Scann and his view on well-being, or what makes for a good life, that these other things are standing in significant personal relationships, such as friendship or love, and success in the achievement of worthwhile goals. There may be other things on the list, I'm open to that. Scanlon considered whether health should be on there, but he rules it out because he thinks that you could might have an organ that's not working properly, so you're not very healthy in that respect. If it doesn't impact on any of these other things, it doesn't make your life any worse. So he doesn't think that's an extra thing. We've already got 3 things on the list, so it's not really much of a system, so maybe other things to be added to it. But even if there are other things, I think these are 2 of the more significant things that contribute towards a good life. So let me just clarify these 2 points a bit further. First of all, it's standing in those personal relationships that makes your life go better. Not the benefits that come with having, say, friends. Right? A misanthropist who doesn't care for anybody and doesn't care for friends, if enough people were fond of him, might get all of the benefits that would come with having friends, but I still think he'll be missing something. He hasn't got any friends. So he might get all the benefits, but his life is not as good as it would be if he got those benefits and actually had real friends, rather than just people who give him the benefit of friends. So I think it's standing in that relationship itself is something that makes for a good life. And that's what I'm going to say. I'll clarify any of these points in discussion afterwards. On the success of worthwhile goals, I want to make 2 points. The first is the notion of a worthwhile goal. It's very easy to hear that in a very moralized way, and that's not how I want you to hear it. What makes for a good life is success in worthwhile goals. Those goals don't have to be morally worthwhile. Right? All they need be, because I'm understanding a worthwhile goal simply as a goal we've got good reason to pursue and to structure large parts of our lives around in this context. These reasons might be moral reasons. You've got good reason to do various moral things like, I don't know, help make the world a more just place or whatever, but they needn't be. They might be academic reasons, aesthetic, scientific, all bound up with a concern to be a good parent, or other reasons bound up with family membership or friends. What makes a reason a good one? Well, in this context, it has to be at least sufficient to justify spending a significant part of one's life in pursuit of it. It has to do more than that. It has to kind of structure your life, I think, to be the right sort of reason. There's more one would have to say. But also, if it integrates with other things that you value, that would be something that would amplify the value of the reason. It has at least to give you sufficient reason to spend significant parts of your time pursuing that goal. And the second point I want to say about success in the pursuit of worthwhile goals, and this is the objectivist bit, is it has to be actual worthwhile goals, not just what you happen to believe, rightly or wrongly, are worthwhile goals. If I succeed in pursuit of a worthless goal that I falsely think is worth pursuing, I've wasted I haven't gained anything. My life's not gone any better. How could bringing a worthless thing into my life make it go better? Now, you might, on the face of it, you might think that's wrong. All that matters is success in the pursuit of what you take to be worthwhile goals, not natural ones. But I think I can persuade you that that's not right. I consider the following case. This is my kind of counterpart self. I imagine I'm such that I think that knowing the number of blades of grass in my garden is the most important thing. So I devote all my spare time counting blades of grass in the garden and look forward to retirement when I can spend all my time in the garden busy counting. Okay? That's me, busy at work here. It's my alter ego, kind of younger with more hair. Now we may suppose that I don't really enjoy counting blades of grass. It is, after all, a rather tedious affair. But because I think the goal is so important, wrongly, I'm prepared to spend all my time doing this. Now I think my friends, and I'm kind of hoping you would agree, I'm wasting my time, I'm wasting my life doing this. Even if I succeed in the pursuit of this particular goal, which I take to be worth pursuing, I've wasted my time. My life's not any better for that success. Why? Because although I take this to be a worthwhile goal, it's not. So if you think my friends are right when they think I'm wasting my time, then you agree with me that what's important is not success in what we believe, rightly or wrongly, to be a worthwhile goal, but rather success in the pursuit of objectively valuable goals. At this point, people tend to get a bit nervous. They say, well, who decides whether some goal's worth pursuing or not? And my kind of flippant answer is no one. It's not the sort of thing anybody could decide. You can get it right or wrong, but it's not the sort of thing anybody could decide is right or wrong. But I think when people ask that sort of question, what they're really asking is just an epistemological question. How do we know which goals are worthwhile and which ones aren't? Well, that's a topic in itself, but actually perhaps you don't need to know. You just need to think about what's attractive, why you think this is worthwhile, such that you've got some justification for believing it's a worthwhile goal. Listen to what others have to say. They might disagree. They might be right. But if you go through all that process, you think about the nature of the task, think about what seems to be the reasons you have for pursuing it, and whether those are good reasons, strong enough to warrant spending a significant part of your life pursuing that goal. And if you don't know at the end of that, then at least you have some justification. And perhaps that's good enough. Okay, just to summarize where we're at. Right, so I've claimed a happy life is a pleasant life. A good life is not the same thing as a happy life, although happiness is one of the things that contributes towards a good life. And at least two other things contribute towards a good life. That is, significant personal relationships and success in worthwhile goals. Okay, on to the question of meaningfulness. Right. So the first thing we've got to do is decide how we're going to understand the question of whether our lives have any meaning. Now there's one way you can hear this question in a rather grand cosmological way, where it's kind of a question asking why we're here, we the species, or why does anything at all exist at all? That's one way to hear it. That's kind of the Hitchhiker Guide to the Galaxy way. But it's not the only way. We can also hear it in a more modest way as a question each of us can pose about our own lives, rather than about the existence of the species of the universe. But then you might be tempted to think that in this more modest way of hearing the question of whether our lives are meaningful, in that more modest way, there's no difference between a question of a good life and of a meaningful life. And that's what I thought. And I did think that up until a couple of months ago. But how do we decide this? How do we decide whether the question of whether we're living a good life is the same as the question of whether we're having a meaningful life in this more modest sense? Well, let's see if the answers to the questions can come apart. So the first way to ask is say, well, suppose I know I've lived a meaningful life. Does it make sense to ask whether it was a good life? And, well, that looks like an odd question to me. One way in which you might have a doubt as to whether you've lived a good life is if you think the meaning that's in your life is being in helping others and involved a huge amount of self-sacrifice. So you've made lots of other people's lives very happy, but a considerable sacrifice to yourself. So your own life has been rather austere. It's meaningful because you've succeeded in pursuing a worthwhile goal of helping many other people. But actually, the cost is that that's actually involved quite significant sacrifice to you, so your life's not gone very well. Theirs has, but at your cost to you. You might think that. But that works with too narrow a notion of what counts for a good life. Remember, it's not just pleasure and happiness that contributes towards a good life, I've claimed, but success in worthwhile goals. Since this is a worthwhile goal, helping others, even though there hasn't been a great deal of pleasure and fun in your life, we're supposing, and a great deal of self-sacrifice, you've succeeded in a very worthwhile goal. And to that extent, I think your life's been a very good life. So I can't think of a... It seems to me that once you've answered the question of whether your life's a meaningful life, that closes off the question of whether it was also good. What about the other way around? Suppose you know you've had a good life. Does it make sense to ask whether your life's been meaningful? Well, I think the example of the pleasure machine shows that it does make sense to ask that question, and the answers could be very different. I mean, a very pleasant life, like one plugged into a pleasure machine, may be, a perfectly good life. But I think it's completely devoid of any meaning whatsoever. Right, and that may be one of the reasons why we'd hesitate to plug ourselves in. Now, I don't know if that would, you'll tend to agree with me on that, but if you consider a paradigm case of meaninglessness, let's start from the other way around, which is the image of the myth of Sisyphus, we look at that and then plug in some pleasure, and I think we can see nothing significant changes. So many of you know the myth of Sisyphus was a rather bad person who committed all sorts of atrocities against humans and many crimes against the gods, and got his comeuppance when punished by Zeus to eternally roll a great big rock to the top of the hill. Unfortunately, the rock would always roll back down, and then he'd have to repeat the process for all eternity. That's his punishment. Graphically illustrated thus. And this is a paradigm of a meaningless life. It's interesting to see why we think of this as a paradigm of a meaningless life. One thing you might think is it's just so arduous, but you can imagine that he's been punished by given a small pebble to roll up the hill. Still looks just as meaningless. Well, to bring us onto the top, help us with the question I'm asking, imagine the gods take pity on poor old Sisyphus. Not so much pity that they actually free him from his punishment, but enough that they inject him with a drug that gives him an overwhelming desire to roll rocks and great satisfaction in doing so. So now he's just absolutely in bliss. Illustrated thus. Right, happy Sisyphus. It still looks just as meaningless as before. He's happy in his work, but it's still as pointless as it was before. But insofar as he's a happy little Sisyphus, there's some degree in which he's living a good life. But it is utterly meaningless. So I think these questions do come apart in that respect. I think that success in pursuit of worthwhile goals can make not only a life good, but also meaningful, but not everything that makes for a good life makes for a meaningful life. Okay. First part of the lecture is supposed to be on freedom. I haven't said anything about freedom yet, apart from the intro. So how does this sort of objectivist picture fit with human freedom? Well, the first thing to note is that a good and meaningful life is one involving success in pursuit of objectively worthwhile goals. Doesn't imply there's just one worthwhile goal we've all got to pursue, which is a relief. There are many worthwhile goals, and it's up to us to choose which to pursue. Roberta mentioned that I was kind of interested in the history of art when I first went to university, and if I'd chosen to spend my life studying the history of art, I think that would have been a worthwhile goal, and if I succeeded in it, which would be highly unlikely given how bad I was at it, then that would have made for a good life. But there was other things I could have chosen. I ended up doing philosophy. I think that's something worth pursuing, philosophical knowledge. And to the extent that I succeed in that pursuit, I think that makes my life go well, which is nice. So there's many different values, many things that contribute towards a good life, many different worthwhile goals. And the idea that these are objectively worthwhile doesn't imply there's just one thing we've all got to go for. There's many different things, and it's up to us and our tastes, preferences, talents to choose which of these to pursue. But you may still think this introduces a limit on choice. Right? Although there's quite a diverse range of different values which, if we pursue them and succeed in the pursuit of them, our lives will go well. Those worthwhile goals are just a subset, quite a small subset, of the number of goals that we could choose to pursue. So they limit the options. And you may think, well, doesn't that limit our freedom to choose how to live? Well, I don't think it does, at least not as I understand freedom. I think to be free is to have the capacity to form beliefs about what we've got good reason to do, or what we ought to do, and to have the capacity to act on the basis of those beliefs. And to save me having to keep saying beliefs about what we've got good reason to do or ought to do, I'll just call those normative beliefs. Free actions are ones that express that capacity to form and act on the basis of normative beliefs. Just to motivate that sort of idea, the idea is that when we act in line with these normative beliefs, that we're in a very strong sense in charge, we're in control. Suppose, this often happens to me, gets late at night and you think, right, I really ought to go to bed, but you don't, and you veg out in front of the telly, and then you really chatter the next morning. That's an unfree act. You chose to stay down, but you thought you ought to go to bed at that point. If you'd have done as you thought you ought to, that would have been a free act, because then you're in control. If you're profoundly weak like me, then you often don't do what you think you should, and then live to regret it. So the idea is you're kind of in control when you're acting in accordance with those sort of normative judgments, and to that extent free, autonomous, like you're the one in charge. When you're not, you're pushed around in a sense by kind of external forces and are unfree. Now those normative beliefs don't have to be true. Come back to truth and falsehood here. Imagine I'm walking through the desert and confront a poisonous snake and freeze. And I think to myself, what I ought to do is run. If I run away, I'm acting in accordance with my normative beliefs, because I think I ought to run. But that's a terrible mistake. What I should do, and if you watched Planet Earth 2 last week and saw the iguanas, the clever ones who froze, what you should do is stand still. But if through terror I stood still thinking I should run, then I've not acted freely. I've lost control, even though I've done the right thing. I'm free insofar as I act in accordance with my normative beliefs, even if they're false, as they would be in this case. So what matters from the point of view of freedom is acting as we believe we should rather than acting as we should. So to care about acting freely is to care about acting in accordance with those normative beliefs. But although we care about acting in accordance with our beliefs about worthwhile goals insofar as we care about acting freely, that's not the only thing we care about. We also care about getting things right. That is, acting in accordance with worthwhile goals. And that's why we think hard about such things at crucial stages in our lives. The pleasure machine might be a crucial stage. If you're confronted with this choice, say, go on, plug yourself in, it would be great. I think you think very hard. If there's a real scenario, you think very hard about that before you plug yourself in, because you wanted to be sure this really would be a good life. But if all we cared about was acting in accordance with our evaluative beliefs, there's nothing to think hard about. You just form an evaluative belief, this would be good. But hey, off you go. Downside of this is if we're mistaken about the worthwhile goals that shape our lives, then like my glass counting counterpart, we will have wasted our lives or a part of our lives. That's one of the costs of objectivity. It means we can get things wrong, which I know everybody knows, but when you think about this, it's often forgotten. As far as that goes, subjectivists have got a preferable position. If you think all that matters in acting in the light of your evaluative beliefs, regardless of whether they're true, life would be so much easier. It would be like being in a maze, where whichever way you decide to go, to get out, is the right way to go, just in virtue of your deciding to go that way. Objectivists recognise that our decisions can be wrong and may leave us lost rather than get out of the maze. There's a deeper worry for objectivists. If you think that good and meaningful life is one in pursuit of worthwhile goals, you might be a skeptic about such things, in which case our lives can't be good and they can't have meaning. The best we could hope for would be a pleasant life, but as we saw with a happiness machine and happy Sisyphus, such a life would still be meaningless. I don't think there's any such, I mean, talk about subjective meaning, but actually I don't think there is such a thing, or at least no such thing that would be an acceptable fallback position. A meaningful life, meaningful, in this sense, would just be a meaningful life with good PR. Sounds good, but it's nothing to it, no substance. But if objectively valuable goals are understood as I understand them, that is, as goals we've got good reason to pursue, I see no good reason to doubt that there are such things. Indeed, the very idea that there could be good reasons to doubt there are good reasons to pursue is deeply paradoxical. Nobody doubts that there are such things as goals, so you'd have to have some sort of skepticism about the idea of there being good reasons. You couldn't have good reason for thinking that. Given there are such values, we can freely choose to incorporate them into our lives, and in doing that, we choose to live a good and meaningful life. We cannot, however, choose that such a life would be a good and meaningful one. We just don't have that ability. Luckily, we don't need it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for giving us a great deal to think about. Interesting lecture. There was a point where I was worried that he was spending his study leave counting blades of grass, but it only lasted, it was a momentary panic. So I'd like to throw the floor open to questions. Yeah.
Are these happiness machines available online?
I bet you there are some. There's not, all you just need is the right sort of empirical psychology, locate the pleasure sensors, plug in the sensors, so just like the pain sensors, just trigger it, off you go. So you'd sign up, would you?
We have two students with microphones working their way around. So there's one question up there and there's one down here.
Isn't there a sort of philosophical happiness machine going on at the moment with the amazing PR and advertising who are getting better and better at using our evolutionary traits and psychology to actually persuade us about being happy means buying their product? You look at the adverts now, you just see, buy my product will make you happy. All sorts of subtle ways and means of that. So in a way, we're constantly bombarded with sort of psychological and philosophical happiness machine memes.
Well, that may be true, but and that does interfere with our freedom to choose, I think, because I didn't spell out all the details, I haven't got details, but at least one of the things that would have to be a constraint on freely choosing something would be that you've arrived at it in a non-biased and non-distorted way. You've not kind of been subtly brainwashed. If you have, then you're not, even if you act in accordance with your beliefs about, I've just got to have this thing. If that's just a result of indoctrination or brainwashing or just even good advertising, there's nothing much to be said for it, and you're not acting freely. It'd still make you happy, we're assuming, I guess. That might be a scam as well, in which case you'd lose out on both scores. But if it makes you happy, there's still, I think what you're getting at is there's something disturbing about that. Well, if it makes you happy, whatever it is, the product they're selling, it's not that it doesn't do what it says it's going to do, but there would be a negative there, because it would interfere with your freedom to choose what sort of products to buy and so on. That's why there's laws about how people can advertise. So people can make, to some degree, more informed choices.
I wondered, where do you think the majority of us are in terms of, do you think, sort of through your research and your experience, that the majority of people are living a happy or a good or meaningful life, and do you think there's been any change in the last century at all? Or?
I don't know about the majority, it depends what kind of group you're. People in here probably are. People in the UK probably are. Remember, meaning, when you talk about a meaningful life, it sounds like it's kind of an on-off switch. You've either got a meaningful life or it's not. But of course it's not like that at all. Meaning comes in degrees, just as value comes in degrees, and people live more or less good lives. I think if you've got friends and you're having a good time, and I don't think it takes much to get on the goodness scale, to live a good life to some degree. But I guess it's hard to kind of, as you go further up, it gets harder and harder, and you need a lot more luck, and you need kind of social structures to enable that, and various things, and a certain salary to pay for it. Especially if you've got some of the things that make you happy are rather expensive. So there's all sorts of external conditions that are outside our control. There's plenty of misery in the world, and well, I've not been kind of flippant, but I don't think it takes particularly much. I think you've got to remember that these are on scales, right? And at the bottom end, it doesn't take you much to get you on the scale. When people talk about, well, that's not a truly meaningful life, they're thinking of it as a sort of on-off switch. It's either meaningful, in which case it's truly meaningful, or it's not, in which case we'd be in big trouble, because none of us will have meaningful lives in that sense. But once you get the idea that meaning comes in degrees, just as the value of life comes in degrees, I think it's, for Western people living in affluent Western countries, it's pretty easy to get on the scale. But that didn't sound too flippant.
Professor, I'd like to ask a question that I think might be the basis for a brief recap on the ground you've covered, helpful to me and perhaps to others. There's a novel called Alone in Berlin, which is based on a true story about a working class couple whose son, living in Berlin during the Second World War, whose son was killed on the Western Front. They decide to distribute postcards anonymously around the city attacking Hitler. Eventually they're caught and executed. How did you analyse their lives in terms of your framework?
Good. There's lots of elements there. I take it they've got a loving relationship.
Yes.
That's on the plus side. The loss of their son is definitely on the negative side. They're pursuing a worthwhile goal there, trying to kind of fight for justice and against tyranny. And if there's even any moderate success, that makes both a good and a meaningful life. Whole package as a whole, I don't know. Don't know what I'd say.
Thank you.
But philosophers talk about pro tanto goods, which is good in a respect. And most lives are a mixture of certain ways in which they're good, certain ways in which they're bad. And this is quite a dramatic mixture, and it's very hard to know what to say about whether all things considered that was a good life or a meaningful life. It certainly has elements of meaningfulness and of value in it. That's what it sounds to me, despite the elements of disvalue.
Thank you.
Hi, we often value lives of people who pursued goals in their own lifetime which were seen as worthless. And is a meaningful life judged by history?
No, I don't think we can be judged by history, but history can get it right or wrong. It doesn't make any difference. Their judgment doesn't make any difference. It's not for them to say. That person, and even if I take some example, somebody who just wasn't recognised in their lifetime, turned out to be a great artist, whatever, like Van Gogh or whatever. Didn't get any recognition of what they're doing. Everybody would have thought they're just wasting their time because they haven't got the talent to do great works of art. But they succeed in producing great works of art. That's a worthwhile goal, regardless of what history or contemporaries say about it. So it's not for history to say, it's for history to get right.
Hi. You make lots of claims about the objective. My understanding of what the objective is something that is not through a perspective, that is not through experience. Yeah, if we are all necessarily, we experience through a perspective, does that not then inherently make the objective incomprehensible?
Well, good question. I don't think so necessarily. I mean, why would you think the perspective is distorted?
Well,
It might be a perspective that enables you to see things right.
but it's still a seeing.
Yeah, but
It's not, there's, the claim of the objective is there is something beyond the seeing, but how is that accessible without the seeing?
well, I wasn't thinking of it as beyond the seeing, but as the thing seen. And that's not beyond the seeing. So it's just that, just in an ordinary perceptual illusion, I can see all before me, and I've taken it that things are the way they seem. I've got no reason to think they're not the way they seem. But of course, there might be an illusion. It might be that I'm dreaming, having an anxiety dream about giving this big talk in front of so many people. So it may be something that seems to be a seeing but isn't really. But I think absent reason to think that it is that way, we're justified in believing things are as they seem. That sounded very kind of techie, but it's supposed to get a simple thought across that just as in the perceptual case, if things seem to you perceptually to be a certain way, that gives you justification for believing that they are that way. I think that's true of the evaluative case. If something seems intellectually to you to be of value, to be something worth pursuing, that gives you, that seeming by itself gives you justification for believing that it is of value. Why else would it seem to you to be that way? Well, absent kind of knowledge of distorting factors or kind of some clever empirical psychology that proves that we're very bad in this sort of area, which there's plenty of that. We can definitely get it wrong, but I think we are justified in taking things to be the way they seem, so long as we don't have good reason to think that they're not. That sounds almost a tautology, but I don't think it is. There's plenty of people who deny that.
Hello, thanks very much for a very interesting. I'm okay. For a very
Sorry,
interesting
it's hard for me to know.
lecture.
All I can hear is up there.
I want to kind of share two worries. They're kind of two sides of the same coin, and then see what you thought about them or how you'd respond. So, one worry would be on the definition of worthwhile goals. You kind of define that as goals that we have good reason to pursue. So the first worry would be that seems like quite easy to fulfill, too easy, you could say. So if I think of a kind of Darwinian, Nietzschean person who is kind of obsessed with maybe involuntary euthanasia of the weak of our species, and so that's a good reason to pursue that, because it might mean that in the coming 1,000 years suffering is reduced by having a really strong species, and so for them they have good reasons to pursue that goal. But for many of us, that would be unethical, and not even just unethical, but also not a good life. That would be a bad life lived in pursuit of that. But then the other kind of side of that coin, the other worry would be that to have a more objective account of a good goal or a good life, seems like the classical philosophers have something that we don't in this account, which is a telos, a kind of objective function or human nature, that without this kind of objective understanding of what it is we're here for, what our purpose is, then how could we even say that something is a morally good human life? And so how you deal with those two worries?
Right, okay, good question. There's lots of good questions there. I'll see if I can remember them all. Okay, first of all, that Nietzsche would think that kind of killing the weak or whatever to promote the strong is something he's got good reason to do. I'd think that was a mistake. Hopefully I'm right and he's wrong. So though he regards himself as having good reason to do that sort of thing, I think he'd be wrong. So it wouldn't turn out to be a worthwhile goal. That's one point. I didn't fully spell out the conditions of something being a worthwhile goal in the sense of being a good reason to pursue some goal. But yeah, I made something about it being sufficient to justify spending a great deal of one's time doing it, pursuing it, and it had to be such as to give a certain structure. There are other conditions as well. I think it has to be reasons which stem from the nature of the goal itself, so not just instrumental reasons, so they wouldn't count, not as an ultimate goal. And there's one for, yes, whether it was morally, I think this may be controversial. I think one could live a good life. Not only was I not understanding that in a moralised notion, I think it might be immoral but still good, unfortunately. Baddies can have a good life. A classic example is Gauguin, who spent his life in pursuit of artistic excellence, abandoned his family, his wife and children, with just a focus on artistic excellence, and succeeded. I think, well, yeah, that's a good life. It's not morally, I don't morally condone it, disapprove it. He abandoned his family. It doesn't sound like a very nice person at all, but it was a good life. So I think a good life doesn't have to be a moral life, and maybe an immoral one. Bad people might get their unjust rewards.
I was wondering whether you could just expand a little bit on acting freely, and when we make a choice to act freely, when do we know we're acting freely and it's not just a product of our social conditioning, cultural conditioning?
Right. Well, first of all, you don't need to know to act freely. But I don't know, I think it's just I'm never sure how to answer this sort of questions. It's kind of, there's no simple way, there's no some sort of test you could run to see if all the distorting factors are out. And you're not just a victim of brainwashing or subliminal influence, thank you. There's no test you can run. You've just got to kind of, be on the lookout and look out for certain signs and perhaps be a bit suspicious sometimes. As I say, I don't think that, so it could be that you think you're acting freely. We don't usually form beliefs about this, I'm guessing. Philosophers do, because they think about all these things all the time. But most people don't. They've got more important things to be getting on with. The acts they freely do, rather than whether or not they're free or not. I'm not sure there's no kind of sign. You've just got to take it case by case. That's a very unsatisfactory answer, but I think it's the truth.
Does happiness not actually, depends on you making a decision, and you make a decision because of the criteria that stands at the time. You can't see into the future, so you've got to do it with what happens there. If it turns out to be a failure, because you accept the fact that you made your decision on those initial facts, does that not mean that you can be happy even through failure?
Well, remember, do you mean have a good life? So remember, happiness is just...
good life, I'm thinking about happiness, and being self-fulfilled. The fact that, things didn't go how you intended because of external sources, which you didn't know about at the time.
Well, I was thinking, suppose you're on your deathbed. I'll actually make it me. That's what I'm on my deathbed, right? And I think I've had a good life because I persuaded myself that I've been successful in the pursuit of philosophical knowledge, and that's a goal worth pursuing, let me suppose. But then you come along, and you're a bit of a skeptic and rather clever, and you persuade me that actually philosophy is a complete waste of time. And I think, oh, bugger, then I die. I think I die thinking I've wasted my life. And that I'd lived all of my life in accordance with what I took to be something worth pursuing, and take myself to be successful in that wouldn't matter.
But if you accept that that was your initial thought and you took all everything into consideration at that point, you would still die happy because you made the decision on the available facts and not on the extraneous ones that came afterwards.
Yeah, well, I think, I don't think I would die. I think I'd die thoroughly miserable. I won't swear, but that'd be an old bugger.
Suddenly realised that Kant was right after all.
It'd have been fun during that. While I was under this delusion, it would have been fun. But it would have been spoilt at the end.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question then. And you started to touch on it in your last comment, really, about the sort of deathbed reflections. I was thinking throughout your lecture about the extent to which we critically reflect on what is meaningful and how that may change as we go through our lives. And is, whether that's part of the kind of natural process. Is that what a midlife crisis is? Is it people actually thinking, is my life meaningful? And the process of reevaluating what is meaningful and whether that's an ongoing one. And also, how to prepare for those kind of reflections on the deathbed, that in order to kind of have the good life, to kind of mentally prepare for the fact that you are going to be critically reflecting on those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that critical reflection is part of a good life. And as you say, you get to a certain age where you really think, okay, let's take stock here. I've been spending all my time doing this. Is really what I want to do with my time. I've been through that recently had a particular role, which was very fulfilling and significant in many ways, but I thought, actually, this is not what I kind of signed up for. So I dropped it. So you have those moments. That's not to say that I thought I was wrong, but I thought that was good for that period, and I was right. So that bit of my life was a good bit.
So what's good and meaningful may change as you move through your life, but I think that's an important point, really.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And then you take assessment, you decide what's really important for you now, and that changes. I mean, when you're a kid, like having fun and going out with your mates is all that matters, isn't it? It wasn't me. I grew up in Essex.
Often when you pursue things, then you kind of move around it and perhaps away from it. Do you understand it?
Sorry, what's the it?
What you have thought was an ideal, and how you were thinking, and you go into it, and it makes other thoughts come into it that really you do withdraw from it.
Yeah. Also, I think it's very tempting to talk about one big goal that shapes everything, where for most of us, there's lots of different things. Kind of doing things with your friends, with your loved ones, doing a bit of philosophy for me, messing about with cars, Essex background again. All these things, perfectly decent things are worth pursuing. For most of us, there's no grand plan. It's all piecemeal. And that changes, but when you kind of look at all the bits over a life, you could probably look back and think, that's okay. That'll do.
Hello. So we've just had recently a question about kind of evaluating your life, and you're kind of talking about the fact that kind of a good life's on scales, kind of grades of good life's not just an on-off switch, and you've got a couple of factors. So you've got kind of happiness as well as the being part of kind of relationships and kind of approach to worthwhile goals. In kind of evaluating a good life, do you have kind of an idea of kind of what's more important on that scale? Is kind of the happiness part more important in the good life, or
I think happiness is the least important. I think that's probably one thing that actually I don't have. Here's a confession. I don't have an answer to this question. So I was kind of fearing somebody would ask me this. I mean, why could pleasure make your life good but not make it meaningful? Why is that asymmetry? Especially since bringing lots of happiness into other people's lives could make your life meaningful, but not bringing it into your own. That's a deep puzzle, but I think one of the reasons that would explain it is just that pleasure's not that important. A lot of the things, remember I'm understanding pleasure in a broad sense, which includes satisfaction. And actually, if you think about the things that give you a great deal of satisfaction, it's not the satisfaction that you value, but the things that satisfy you. And they tend to be not things to do with pleasure, but things to do with success in worthwhile goals. You think, did well there. So I definitely think that the relationships, which hopefully involves quite a bit of fun as well, which is all for the good, and success in worthwhile goals are more important for a good life than pleasure. I don't think pleasure, that's a kind of thrown in for free with a lot of these, but it's not very important. And that's why a life in a pleasure machine I'm guessing many people wouldn't sign up for.
Possibly for a weekend.
Yeah!
If there was a sort of, not a permanent option, but I think many of us found that an attractive concept in the short term.
It'd be like a weekend at a spa or
There's
something.
one on the aisle here and in the middle there.
Just following on from the other comments, really, is there some benefit in the governments or society misdirecting us somewhat with regard to what makes us happy? I think we all, with all the advertising that was spoken about earlier, I think the good thing about us wanting to be plugged into a happiness machine ad infinitum is it's very good for the economy and GDP.
But you're not very productive.
I mean, if we spend to make us happy, obviously that's part of being in a capitalist society. Now, your lecture alluded to, relationships are important to happiness and pursuing worthwhile goals. Now, if we live in a capitalist society and we want to spend, or we're advertised to spend, we obviously need to be pursuing other people's goals, working for companies and business, whatever. So there is this trade-off, isn't there, between consuming and having possibly a meaningful life. And we know there's no real correlation between GDP, for example, and happiness of the populace.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to think, is there some trade-off between being in a capitalist society and happiness from that perspective?
Well, as I say, I'm just a subjectivist about happiness. You're having a new stereo makes you happy, brilliant, fine. And that we live in a capitalist society doesn't stop that. It makes, and satisfying those sorts of desires easier. But remember, having that wouldn't be a significant factor in a good life. And that's why if you kind of buy into the consumer, as so many of us, including myself, have done, it's all kind of, you desperately want these things and you get it and you think, oh, what's next? Doesn't really contribute in a it's nice, I'm not mocking it. And it's nice to be in a position where you can indulge these pleasures. But it's not a very significant factor in a good life, I don't think.
That's the thing. I think, are we being misdirected?
No, well, it depends what you think. If it's being portrayed as something that's going to lead to a good life, then you are being misdirected, because it's probably not going to be a major factor in that. Not being misdirected, it's just not very significant. So to that extent, it's probably not very misleading, it's distorting. If they say it's going to make you happy, probably will. Not for very long, usually. Because then you want the next kind of upgrade, the next iPhone 10 or whatever. So I think one of the helpful things about distinguishing these things, we can think more clearly. Once you distinguish happiness from a good life, the question of what makes you happy, what makes for a good life, you can separate these things and think more clearly about whether some campaign, either a political campaign or an advertising campaign, is honest or misleading, or in what way it's misleading.
Thank you very much again. Sorry for another question. It's just your talk is very fascinating for me. I just wanted clarity on a point. In your opinion, so should we be going for the good life? Should we be going for a meaningful life? What is it that one should be trying to achieve out of their life? Is it the meaningful part? I just want to
remember, these aren't
clarify.
exclusive, because anything that makes you happy is going to contribute towards a good life as well. I just don't think it's a very significant part of a good life, but it's definitely a contributory factor. So the happier a life is, the better it's going, all other things being equal. And remember, both meaning and the meaning of a life and the goodness of a life are on scales. So I'm not going to say one's better than the other, because a lower point of meaning might be very high on a point of goodness. So it's not like you say, well, that would be better than that, but it depends where you are on the scale of both of them. So that was a kind of evasive answer. I don't think there's a way of answering that without kind of fixing things. I think you don't have to choose, because many of the things, unless you're kind of a pure hedonist, in which case I don't think you'll have a particularly good life, and you definitely won't have a meaningful life. There, that's putting the cards on the table.
But you might have fun.
Thank you.
You'll have a hell of a lot of fun. I think I've been one round to this.
All right, I think that Philip's been very generous in answering so many questions, and that it's probably time to draw to a close. He's given us a huge amount to think about. We'll all be going home this evening thinking about what is good, meaningful and free in our lives, and I know that we'll be thinking about that for a long time to come. And we may be asking his advice on whether we're leading meaningful lives. He may have set himself up for that. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Philip